So many people do these long extended fasts. And interestingly, I was listening to Dr. Courtney Snyder, and she made a clear distinction between fasting and starvation. And she basically said that fasting is, which is what Eric Berg calls intermittent fasting, is only 24 hours or less. In other words, it would be like skipping a meal or maybe skipping 2 meals and doing 1 meal a day, which would bring you up to 24 hours. And that is technically what's called fasting. But starvation is basically what happens if you do it much longer than that, like if you do it for multiple days or even weeks. And now, what precisely does this refer to? It basically refers to the fact that starvation is considered a stress on your body. So it's considered something that, say, would elevate cortisol, would basically be stressful for you. And whereas like fasting would be something that doesn't necessarily put stress on your body. So that's kind of the delineation between fasting and starvation is whether or not it's stressful on your body. And it is worth noting that for women, in particular, Dr. Elizabeth Bright does not recommend fasting for women at all. The only type of fasting that she would consider would be what she calls fat fasting, where you're actually eating fat throughout the whole fast. But in any case, I just wanted to point out that there is technically potentially a difference between fasting and starvation because it has to do with whether or not you're putting stress on your body. With that said, that's really for people like who are on a good diet, like carnivore diet. And there, if you're on a bad diet, like if you're actually eating high carb and you're eating, poisons and plant toxins all the time, then by all means, like stop eating that stuff and consider fasting for longer periods of time if you're like forcing yourself to eat toxins. So that's like, but if you're on a good diet, like the carnivore diet, then as Anthony Chafee points out, you technically don't really need to do extended fast. Like you don't need to get into this starvation period because it adds stress to your body. And then the one exception might be for people who actually have cancer. In that case, Anthony Chafee does recommend these sort of extended fasts, like say multi-day fasts, because you're actually trying to starve the cancer cells. So you actually want this kind of starvation effect for the cancer cells there. That's a different situation. But all I'm trying to say is that personally, I don't do starvation. I don't want to put my body in a stressful state. I will occasionally skip a meal and do fasting, but I do not do starvation.